Welcome back to another video lecture. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing Erasmus of Rotterdam, who is often known as the Prince of Humanists. And the purpose of this lecture is going to be to answer the question, how was Northern Humanism different from Italian Humanism? So Rotterdam is in the Netherlands, so now we're going to shift from the Italian Renaissance and the Italian Peninsula up to the north and try to take a look at this. So who was Erasmus? And there you can see on the map, at least, the different areas of Europe where Erasmus lived. He was a Dutch humanist of immense learning and talent who traveled widely across Europe and became one of the most famous figures of his time. And he lived from 1466 to 1536. And he's proof positive that the work of Italian humanists greatly influenced thinkers outside the Italian peninsula, a question that often comes up on the exam. So how is it that we see the Italian humanists and their work spreading? Well, Erasmus is one of those people that through trade contacts was able to become acquainted with some of the ideas and the practices of the Italian humanists and began himself to perfect them and further the studies. So he moved about Europe quite a bit. He lived in England, he lived in Rome, he lived in the Holy Roman Empire, and he lived in Switzerland. And he developed over the course of his long life many friendships and contacts, and in particular with leading men and thinkers in the areas that he visited. And as I said already, he was a very learned or erudite man who channeled his humanist learning into biblical scholarship and theological questions. And so this then is the answer to our question of how Northern humanism differs from Italian humanism. So at the very outset of this lecture, we already understand that the humanists of the North are going to be more concerned with spiritual, biblical, and theological matters. So, and one of the questions then that Erasmus takes up is how to be a good Christian. And Erasmus used his immense learning and his pen really to kind of criticize, and savagely so at times, the corruption within the Catholic Church and its teachings and practices. And he did so to expose the weaknesses of the human beings who called themselves Catholics, and in particular monks and priests. And he really charged them of living lives of folly. So here we have leading men in the Catholic Church, from cardinals and bishops, popes, and monks, and he really accuses, levels the charge that they were really men of folly, who really didn't know what they were doing, even though outwardly they pretended to know what they were doing. So, and what Erasmus ultimately concludes, however, is that folly, far from being a negative quality, rather is a quality that is needed in order to be a true follower of Christ. So, in answer to the question, how to be a good Christian, then one needs to find folly, or to engage in folly, in a sense, to be a true follower of Christ. So that might sound strange, yet I think that is the lesson that Erasmus arrives at, or the conclusion that Erasmus arrives at in his major work called The Praise of Folly. So while Erasmus can be considered by some a stern moralist with a serious mission, that is, reforming the church through criticism, he was also interested really in uncovering the best way to be a devout person and by following the examples of Christ. And all his learning and erudition came down to a single message, and that is folly. So I think you get the idea that Erasmus has in how to be a good Christian. So I'm going to now provide a summary of several of Erasmus's major works, so that you have a better sense of what Erasmus represented, and by extension then the idea of Northern humanism, and that is really that humanist training is going to be very different, or humanist conclusions are going to be very different from those that we saw in the Italian peninsula. So, number one, we see here the New Testament, both Greek and Latin, and Erasmus published a Greek New Testament in 1516, and then a Latin one in 1519. So Erasmus's basic belief, and again here we see his humanism very clearly, was that in order to read the Bible, one had to be knowledgeable in the languages the Bible was written in. And those languages are Greek, the New Testament written in Greek, and the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, written in Hebrew. So what Erasmus does essentially is learned Greek, and then he produced a new Greek edition of the New Testament. And this was the first edition of the New Testament in Greek in Europe in the modern period, after the reintroduction of the Greek language in the Italian peninsula that we talked about with Manuel Chrysolorus, for example, from 1397 to 1403, who taught Greek in Florence. And so why produce a new testament in the original language? Well, it was to really underscore the fact that translators working in the early part of the Catholic Church, that is in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, who translated from Greek into Latin, had committed errors, and these errors had been transmitted over time into various successive copies of the Latin Bible. So Erasmus's idea was to go back to the original, the language of Greek, and try to get it right. And on the page here, you can see on the left-hand side there's the Greek version that Erasmus produced, and then on the right-hand side, the Latin version. So what I say is, hey, this is philology on steroids. So Erasmus is trying to clean up the errors of the copyists that copyists had made over the centuries, and trying to get back to the true and original or authentic meaning of the Bible. And that's going to be really important to Erasmus's work and idea of trying to be a better Christian. By the way, that's also going to influence somebody named Martin Luther, who's going to launch himself a major challenge to the Catholic Church. Another work that Erasmus wrote was a life of St. Jerome, really a biography of St. Jerome. And if you don't know who St. Jerome is, he's seated there at his desk in his study, or in his scriptorium, and he is the man responsible for translating the New Testament from Greek into Latin in the 4th century of the Common Era. So he's considered one of the major figures in the Church's history, and one of the Church Fathers for his work. And St. Jerome's Bible in Latin is known as the Vulgate, and it stood unchallenged for over 1,000 years, until the work of humanist philologists began to pave the way for new biblical editions, correcting some of the errors and omissions in translation. And we remember the figure of Lorenzo Valla, who, through his own philological work, discovered that the donation of Constantine had been falsified. And so this is the idea, to go back to, as much as possible, the authentic and original text. So this is something that we see Erasmus using his great humanist learning and scholarship and knowledge of language to work on the Bible and the translation of the Bible. The next work that I want to mention is Erasmus's Enchiridion, or Handbook of the Christian Soldier. And in this book, Erasmus presented really his view of Christianity as he constructed it. And again, that idea of constructing ideas is a very humanist idea, whether you're constructing yourself or you're constructing new interpretations and visions of the world. This is something that the Italian humanists had done, but it was more secular in nature, pagan at times. Now Erasmus is going to turn this into a work dedicated to spiritual needs and concerns. So another influential church father, St. Augustine, and if we think about the Augustinians, we think about Villanova University as an Augustinian university. St. Augustine wrote a book himself, again in the 4th century of the Common Era, with the same title, the Enchiridion. And so what we see is Erasmus was openly imitating one of the classical greats, and this was St. Augustine. So in the Enchiridion, what does Erasmus argue? Well, he argues that the great weapons of the Christian foot soldier are prayer and knowledge of the Bible, and that to get to the true message and the essence of the Bible, one had to read it in the original language, something I've already mentioned. So the only way to learn then these languages, that is ancient Greek and Latin, was to read a lot of literature written by ancient Greeks and classical Latin. And as the Renaissance humanists in Italy had rediscovered these texts and made them available through their copying, and later the printing press developed, invented in the 1450s, made possible the duplication of these works from the ancient world and then their diffusion. So somebody like Erasmus then, working in the 1500s, is able to have copies of Greek and Latin works, and he read extensively. And his purpose was, again, to learn the language of the original text, and especially Greek, and then later, of course, Jerome writing in Latin. So that's what he does. And Erasmus, much like Petrarch, argued that any truth that comes out of a pagan text is really attributable to Christ, so that reading pagan texts is not a sin, is not a problem, because they were in some way inspired by Christ. So that's kind of an interesting little thing that Erasmus does to get around the idea that reading classical texts that from the pagan world might be, in fact, a violation. So this is, again, this Enchiridion then is considered to be one of the great works of Christian or Northern humanism, again, to inspire the idea of the Christian foot soldier, prayer and knowledge of the Bible. And so we're going to get to then Erasmus's last work, and that is his greatest and most well-known and widely read work today, and that's called the Moriae Encomium, or the Praise of Folly. If you don't like that Latin word, that the title Moriae Encomium, kind of difficult as a mouthful. However, in this work, the speaker or narrator in the story is a character called Folly. And Folly is the daughter of Wealth and Youth. So when you put Wealth and Youth together and they have a child, it's called Folly. And you can see Folly there pictured on the right, lecturing to a group of students who are also dressed, as you can see, in the figure of court jesters or clowns, something we should be quite aware of in our world today. Folly is really then itself, like all of the other works we've seen, modeled on the work of a 2nd century Roman satirist by the name of Lucian, who worked in Rome, and whose works of literature, that is, mixed both the serious and the comic. And so as the story by Erasmus, The Praise of Folly, unfolds, the focus of Folly is going to shift as he goes along. And the work is divided up into a couple of different parts. So in the first part of the story, Folly discourses and talks about the folly of human things, such as human procreation. How silly is human procreation? That is the act of procreation. How silly is that? Folly also exposes the folly of each stage of human life. We start out as babies, we become adolescents, then we become teenagers, we become young adults, and each stage of life itself is accompanied with moments of folly and silliness, etc. And Folly really states that the only people who, generally speaking, are able to speak the truth are fools. That may not make sense, but that was the conclusion of Erasmus stated in his work through the character Folly. And this is the part of the work that is lighter and more comic. However, in the second part of Erasmus's Praise of Folly, things get a lot more serious and even savage. And so in the second part of the story, the tone of the satire moves from human frivolity to a more fierce and savage attack on religious figures and their corruption. And Folly attacks theologians, that is, priests, bishops, cardinals, popes in particular, who pursue their own learning and their own pleasure at the expense of living a good Christian life. And Folly attacks these religious authorities, and in particular, again, popes and monks, for being hypocrites, that is, not being faithful to the word of Christ and to the example of Christ in this life as it appears through the biblical stories about Christ. So here we have that Erasmus really trying to challenge the church. Now, what makes Erasmus interesting is he's a fierce and outspoken critic of the church and its abuses of power, yet Erasmus never wanted to leave the church. He simply wants to expose the problems of the church to people in order that the church could reform itself. And so that's going to make Erasmus quite different from Martin Luther. And if that will end here. Thank you very much.